Hi, everyone. Welcome to Black History Quest, Oregon Black Pioneers History Research and Conversation Program, sponsored by the Collins Foundation. And my name is Mariah Rocker, and I'm your host for this evening. Thank you so much for spending an hour of your day with us. We're coming to you live on the Oregon Black Pioneers Facebook and YouTube pages. So if you can't stick around for the whole show, don't worry. You'll be able to find this and every episode of Black History Quest on the Oregon Black Pioneers YouTube page. But what is Oregon Black Pioneers? We are Oregon's only nonprofit dedicated to preserving and promoting the experiences of people of African descent statewide. We illuminate this seldom told history through a variety of ways, including books that you can purchase on our website, lesson plans that are available for free to download on our website, exhibits that you can find online or all across the state, and programs that happen in person and virtually, like this one. Now, this is our 13th episode of Black History Quest. And Black History Quest is an OBP original program designed to help us uncover more about Oregon's Black history. We get the privilege of hiring local researchers to act as our history investigators, providing a platform for them to share what they've learned and how they discovered it. Thanks to the support of the Collins Foundation, we add to our understanding of Oregon's Black history every episode. Join us every other month as we meet online with fellow Oregon Black pioneers to engage with this history and take a peek behind the curtain of historical research. Each and every episode is archived on our YouTube channel for those of us who can't join us live on the show. And if you're watching this in the future, thank you. But for those of you who are watching live, make sure to leave your questions in the chat section of the live stream so that we can discuss them on air after the presentation. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Tonight, we are so lucky to have Greta Wisnewski as our new history investigator. Greta Wisnewski is a public and oral historian who works as the program manager for Vanport Mosaic, a memory activism platform committed to amplifying, honoring, and preserving silenced histories of marginalized communities. So they are an organization that we get the pleasure of working with all the time, telling these stories. She's also a consulting historian for the Justice for Greenwood Foundation, who works to secure justice and reparations for the Greenwood community through direct services, public education, and advocacy. Greta grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and has lived in Portland since 2009. And she earned her MA in history with a focus on public and oral history in 2018 from Portland State University. Now, with that, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Greta Wisnewski. Hi, Greta.
Hi, Mariah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us as today's history investigator.
Happy to be
here. We're really thrilled to have you, honestly. So now that you're here, we can kind of dive in and get into the questions. So the first thing that I want to ask is I want you to tell us a little bit about the source that you were looking into and, why did it catch your attention?
Yeah. So when you reached out to me, when Oregon Black Pioneers reached out to me about doing this Black History Quest program, and you told me what it was about, and it was really exciting to me, and I was just having a really hard time zeroing in on a source. So I talked to Laura Loforti, who's the co-director of Vanport Mosaic, and she's my friend and colleague. And we just have this big backlog of things that we've never quite gotten to get into yet. And this is sort of at the top of our list, something we've always wanted to get into. So I just want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to kind of be able to dovetail this and do that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's so perfect. The timing that this is happening during the Vanport Mosaic Festival, which I'm sure you'll mention, is really feels like kismet. So yeah, we're really glad that you're gonna be looking into this source. And I'm curious, what sorts of questions did you have when you found it? Like, what were you hoping to uncover with this research?
Well, when I first saw it, I just thought, what is the story here? I'll show the source in a little bit and talk a little bit more about it, but it was actually really hard for me to come up with a focused question, and I kind of feel like I never really did. My question's a little bit of a two-parter, but yeah, just coming to it with a really open line of inquiry, just being really curious about who the people were and the organization that I'm looking into, and how that organization's efforts played out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, really exciting to learn that there was an organization like this, and hopefully they were successful, but I guess we'll kind of find out in your presentation. So now that we're all excited to learn more, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to present.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mariah. Okay, so I sort of talked about a little bit of this already. Um, and I'm also, full transparency, kind of getting used to a new way of doing a slideshow. So bear with me, everyone. I'm going to do my best. So I already mentioned kind of how I came to this source. So I'm going to just skip ahead to that. So this is an Oregon Journal newspaper article from June 14th, 1948, entitled "Cash for Vanport Victims Wanted." The first paragraph reads, "Demands that each Vanport refugee be granted $250 immediately, and that each registered tenant of the former housing project ultimately be granted $2,000 for himself and $1,000 for each dependent, were made Sunday afternoon by a majority of persons attending a meeting called by the Citizens Committee for Flood Disaster and the Vanport Tenants League." So this brings me to my big question, which, like I said, is a two-parter. Who were the people behind the Vanport Tenants League, and what became of their fight to get reparations for Vanport flood refugees? So let's start by laying out what we already know. Before doing this research, I didn't know much at all about the Vanport Tenants League. I had just seen their name maybe a handful of times, so I knew that they existed, and that's about it. And from this article, I knew they were involved in efforts to secure reparations for Vanport flood refugees in the form of cash grants. I also knew that there was something called the Citizens Committee for Flood Disaster that they were working with. I didn't know how they were connected or anything. I also knew about Vanport, and while I know that a lot of people who are watching probably also know about Vanport, I'm just going to give a quick rundown of what Vanport was and is, in case there are people who don't. So Vanport City, Oregon was the largest wartime public housing project in the United States, and at its peak, it was the second largest city in Oregon, housing over 40,000 residents. Built over a period of just 110 days in 1942 on a floodplain midway between Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington, it was home to thousands of Henry J. Kaiser's wartime shipyard workers and their families, many of whom traveled from all over the country on special Kaiser trains to work in the shipyards and build new lives. Vanport was home to African Americans, Hispanic, Native American, Asian, and white residents, among others, making it, at the time in particular, the most racially diverse city in a state with a deeply exclusionary history, as Oregon's original constitution had banned Black people from living or owning property within its borders. While housing remained unofficially segregated, schools and public spaces were integrated, bringing together Black, Native, Hispanic, Asian, and white residents in daily life. As World War II ended and jobs dried up, Vanport lost about half of its population. Federal funding disappeared, and it began to fall into disrepair due to neglect, really on the part of the Portland Housing Authority, or HAP, Housing Authority of Portland, who began working to dismantle the empty units. For many residents, particularly people of color who faced Portland's discriminatory housing practices, Vanport remained their only housing option. By 1948, about 18,500 people still called Vanport City home. On Memorial Day of 1948, the Columbia River flooded and Vanport, all of those people's homes, the entire city was washed away in a matter of hours. So that's our starting point. And now I'm going to take you into the research. So my first method was just a general online search, kind of a quick and dirty Google search using the names of the two organizations mentioned in the original source. And that led me to a number of secondary sources, a few articles, a couple of books, and a podcast. And all of those gave me a little more information to go on. And then I even found a couple of primary sources this way by searching the City of Portland's archive catalog online. So next, I searched Vanport News, or just newspapers online, for any appearances of the Vanport Tenants League or the Vanport Citizens Emergency Disaster Committee. And I found a lot. These are really just a small selection of all the ones I found. Honestly, it was a little overwhelming, and I really didn't expect to find this much at all. And like I said, it's way more than this. But I was really excited that I did find as much as I did. And from there, I found names of some of the people involved in the work of the Tenants League. And there were so many people doing this work, and many of them were involved in civil rights and, other civil rights and labor organizing. A number of them, quite a few of them, were accused of being communists and were on FBI watch lists, which I got to look at some of that stuff when I went to the Portland City Archives and Records, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So the Vanport Tenants League was an interracial coalition of people who had at least one thing in common, and that was that they were all residents of Vanport. They were all tenants, because everyone who lived in Vanport was a tenant. So it was hard, but I eventually zeroed in on 3 people whose names appeared pretty regularly in the newspaper articles to focus on. And they were Carmen Parrish Walker, Samuel G. Whitney, and Estes H. Curry. So I did newspaper searches for each of their names, and I also researched them on Ancestry.com to see what I could learn about their lives before and after their work with the Vanport Tenants League. In parallel to this, I also arranged a visit to the City of Portland Archives and Records. I started by emailing them, just asking if they had anything in their archive relating to either of these organizations. And the archivist over there, Aisha Khan, was just amazingly helpful and really went above and beyond with what she pulled for me. So there again, I found a ton of relevant material. And at this point, my head was really starting to spin with trying to figure out relationships and what happened when and who all was involved. And yeah, so I built a research workbook in Google Drive to help organize these scattered elements, the newspaper articles, and all the disparate pieces. I organized them chronologically and had like a special column for names and all that kind of thing. So I could just see how it all fits together. And I will say that there are a multitude of stories here, and any one of them deserves their own presentation, truly. But for the sake of meeting the brief of my Black History Quest assignment, I've really tried to stay focused on my big question, which, to remind myself of what that is, and all of us, is who were the people behind the Vanport Tenant League and what became of their fight to get reparations for Vanport flood refugees. I'm going to fix this. I have sun glaring in my eyes. Okay, that's a little better. So without getting too much into the weeds, I do think it's important to mention that before we start seeing the Vanport Tenants League, we see another organization that was active in Vanport before from, it was called the Vanport Interracial Council. And from what I could tell, they were around from September of 1944 to September of 1946. And there was some overlap with the Tenants League because some of the people involved in the Vanport Interracial Council were also involved in the Vanport Tenants League, like Samuel Whitney. So the Vanport Tenants League appears to have held their first meeting at 8 p.m. on Friday, November 29th, 1946 in Community Building Number 1 in Vanport. One of the articles describes the League as a new organization formed with the aim of enlisting participation of Vanport's tenants interested in civic betterment. Some of the things they talked about during this first meeting were how to prevent the Vanport Hospital from shutting down. It was scheduled to close on December 31st. obtaining better street lighting, and the adjustment of rents in cases where hardships were involved. At this meeting, 140 veterans attending the Vanport Center College signed petitions protesting the hospital closure, arguing that the shutdown would leave the community without adequate medical care. Around this time, Samuel G. Whitney, who was himself a veteran, wrote a letter to the editor of the Oregon Daily Journal advocating for the hospital's continued operation. So some quick background on Mr. Whitney. He's actually the one that I found the most about, so this will be probably the longest background piece. Samuel Gerthus Whitney was born in Louisiana on December 18th, 1905. His family were listed on the census as being farm laborers. He registered for the draft on October 16th of 1940 and served in the Navy during World War II. A later article mentions that at some point he was a journalism student at the University of Colorado, but I'm not sure when that was. By 1946, Whitney had relocated to Vanport, where he lived at 4006 Cottonwood, apartment 844, and became an active member of the Vanport Tenants League. Also served on the Vanport City School Board, where he worked with School Superintendent James Hamilton, and that'll come into play a little bit later. Whitney was a member of the Portland branch of the NAACP and was active in the Multnomah County Young Democrats. In March of 1946, Whitney ran for Democratic state rep. While he didn't win, he did receive 12,233 votes. In 1947, Whitney worked as a mason tender for the John L. Hudson Construction Company at the Hanford Atomic Energy Plant in Richland, Washington. And after just 18 days of employment, he was fired on security grounds for alleged Communist Party affiliation. Whitney denied being a communist, stating he may have unknowingly associated with some people who were. But anyway, he appealed his dismissal to President Truman, the Federal Employees Loyalty Board, and some other agencies, arguing that the firing was unjust and violated democratic principles. Urban League Executive Director Edwin C. Berry and Vanport School Superintendent James Hamilton both spoke out in support of Whitney, attesting to his loyalty. Okay, so back to the Tenants League, their pre-flood work. So it seems their efforts with the hospital were successful as it was operating right up until the flood hit in 1948. I don't know if they ever got those streetlights, but during this time, they also fought for fair rent adjustments, and they won those as well. The VTL sent out these rent reduction flyers that read in part, "Dear fellow tenant, the Housing Authority of Portland announced the adoption of an adjusted rent program for all low-income families living in federal housing projects." In a front page article on October 18th, the Oregonian gave full credit to the Vanport Tenants League as the organization which brought this issue to a head. This victory resulted from a 4-month campaign by the Tenants League. So they had some wins there. And then the following month, it's a little sweet side note, they threw a Mother's Day celebration on Sunday, May 11th, 1947, where they arranged for music and entertainment by Vanport Junior High School singing groups, Clara May Walker, the Harmonizing Five, and the Southern Air Gospel Singers. Apparently, they also nominated a Vanport mother during that. For the Mother's Day event, their venue of choice was Community Building Number 1 at Vanport, which is the slide right here, where Miss at the time, Carmen Parrish, was working as assistant director. So a little background on her. Carmen Ursel Parrish was born on September 5th, 1921 in Marked Tree, Poinsett, Arkansas, to John Parrish and Flora Parrish. Her father worked as a laborer and her mother was a housewife. Both parents were born in Mississippi. She graduated on May 24th, 1943, with a degree in home economics from Alcorn Agricultural and Mechanical College, a public historically Black land-grant university in Mississippi. She married Wilson Calvin Walker on July 18th, 1947, in Portland. And Mr. Walker was 27 and was a student at the time, while Mrs. Carmen Parrish Walker was 25, and she listed her occupation as project service advisor. In September of 1947, Carmen Walker was featured in an Oregonian article detailing African Americans in Portland who were working jobs that were historically closed to Black workers. She was identified as the assistant director of a community building at Vanport. And then on May 30th, 1948, Memorial Day, the day of the flood, Vanport residents received a notice from the Housing Authority of Portland. It was slipped under many of their doors or left outside. And that read in part, "Remember, dikes are safe at present. You will be warned if necessary. You will have time to leave. Don't get excited." That same day, the Oregon Daily Journal has a photo collage on page 10 of various ways people are preparing for the rising floodwaters of the Columbia. And in the middle of that collage, we see Samuel Whitney caulking cracks in the seawall in preparation for the flood. So around 4 p.m. that day, this is supposed to be a video, and it's not going to work, so just imagine if it did. It shows video footage of the flood. Around 4 p.m. that day, the Columbia River broke through the railroad embankment and unleashed a 10-foot wall of water that destroyed Vanport within a matter of hours. At least 15 people died and 18,500 were left homeless. 1/3 of the flood victims were Black residents, many of whom were forced into inadequate temporary housing. Within days, we begin to see newspaper article reports about the Vanport Tenants League organizing to secure adequate temporary housing, cash compensation for Vanport flood victims, and to hold responsible parties accountable, namely the Housing Authority of Portland. The first reported post-flood mass meeting by the Vanport Tenants League was held in the auditorium of Benson Polytechnic High School and was attended by over 1,000 Vanport City flood refugees who, during that meeting, they passed resolutions demanding grand jury and congressional investigation of the flood, cash compensation for losses, the resignation of the Portland Housing Authority, and censure for failure to evacuate or properly warn residents, enactment of a city rent control ordinance freezing rentals at May 30th levels, long-range planning for permanent housing under a federal agency with no discrimination because of race, creed, or color, requisition of hotels and auto courts immediately at federal and state expense to provide emergency housing, and opposition to the use of tents, battleships, or trailer-type dwellings for temporary housing. In the Benson Tech Auditorium that evening, where they were having the meeting, was Mrs. Carmen P. Walker, who by then was the director of the community building in Vanport. She was among those named as being part of the Vanport Citizens Emergency Disaster Committee, which I figured out was a subcommittee of the Vanport Tenants League that they formed in response to the flood. The chairman of the league at the time was Mr. Estes H. Curry, who was conducting the meeting. So I'll tell you a little bit about Mr. Curry. Estes Henry Curry was born on April 16th, 1918 in Lancaster, Texas. According to the 1930 census, he lived with his mother, Pearl, and 5 siblings and was the oldest child. His 1940 draft registration shows he was employed by the YMCA in Dallas, Texas, and that he, at the time, was married to Mrs. Minnie Mae Curry. I didn't find anything more really about him at this time period before, beyond the work that he did with the Vanport Tenants League and after. So that is all the about his life that I found out for prior to that. So Curry was running the meeting that day, and he was quoted in a number of newspapers as saying that he wanted to make it known that members of the League would have no so-called buck passing, whitewashing, or secret investigations of the Vanport City flood of last Memorial Day. On June 9th, Portland's civil rights attorney Irvin Goodwin, who served as counsel for the Vanport Citizens Committee, sent a letter. Well, he was also a member. He sent a letter to Portland City Council on behalf of the committee that laid out their list of resolutions and called for a city council hearing. Other members of the council who signed the letter included Samuel G. Whitney and James Hamilton. On June 16th, 1948, they got their hearing, and members of the Vanport Citizens Committee for Flood Disaster presented their list of resolutions to the City Council. Newspapers reported that more than 300 Vanport flood refugees were in attendance and that there were many more who stood outside. Representing the Vanport Citizens Committee for Flood Disaster of the Vanport Tenants League were Irvin Goodman, who again was a civil rights attorney in Portland, and Vaughn Albertson, who had been a Vanport College professor. This article mentions that by prearrangement, only 5 people gave testimonies. Mrs. Carmen Walker was one of those people, and that the audience sat passively, even though the council had arranged for half a dozen policemen to be in the courtroom just in case things got out of hand. So at the end of the hearing on the 16th, Mayor Earl Riley asked, "Anything else, Irvin?" And Irvin Goodman gave the following closing remarks. "Mr. Mayor and members of the City Council, I'd just like to make a brief parting statement. I don't profess to be an authority on municipal jurisprudence. However, I have checked the City Charter of 1942, and I believe that the City Council does have legal authority to grant relief in some of the matters that have been brought to your attention. First, with reference to the freezing of rents, I believe the City Council has authority to freeze rents under the police power, point number 1 of section 2-105. Secondly, with reference to making an emergency appropriation, I think the City Council has that authority under the 1942 Charter. Lastly, with reference to taking over available rooms in hotels and auto courts, the City Council has that authority under point 30 of section 2-105. Thank you." Mayor Riley then closed the hearing and referred the matter to the Department of Public Safety. This is a picture showing members of the Vanport Tenants League and the Citizens Committee gathering outside City Hall for the next meeting, which was the morning of June 30th, 1948. While other members of the League and the committee were inside at the City Council hearing, these folks showed their support by holding signs calling for flood victims' compensation, protesting the use of trailers for emergency housing, and demanding dismissal of the housing authority. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find much between that June 16th City Council meeting or hearing and the one that happened on June 30th. And I think the one on June 30th may have been the last one. And from what I can glean between those two hearings, there was some back and forth communication between the Citizens Committee and the city attorney, who reviewed and responded to the committee's resolutions. I was able to review the meeting minutes both for the June 16th and the June 30th City Council hearings at the Portland City Archives. And Vaughn Albertson spoke on behalf of the Citizens Committee at that June 30th one and asked for them to reconsider at least 2 of their resolution points. So I'm going to read a bit of his opening remarks because I think, or I hope, that it helps shed some light on where things were at by this point in time. So Mr. Vaughn Albertson says, "I'm here this morning to request that 2 points be reconsidered. 2, that, in the opinion of the city attorney, the council does not have legal authority to act. One of these is the matter of city rent control, which I believe was stated was possible, though in the attorney's opinion, the city attorney's opinion, would not be feasible or effective. The other was the matter of reorganization of the Portland Housing Authority, the appointment either of an entirely new housing authority or at least a reorganization of the body with a view of representing a wider cross-section of the community. I maintain on these 2 points that since the last hearing, which was 2 weeks ago, considerable additional evidence has come to light, which would amply justify the action we request, both in the manner of some ordinance, which will prevent the flood victims being victimized by landlords and others taking advantage of their circumstances, which we have had numerous instances of that being done. The suffering didn't end with the flood. It has been added to since. We also have evidence that in the evacuating of Vanport, the Housing Authority was guilty of a very tragic miscalculation, to say the very least, but they are not facing the resulting emergency realistically or adequately. There are numerous complaints of management and discrimination and indifference to the needs of the former tenants of Vanport. So after he spoke, there were a number of people who gave testimonials during the hearing that addressed a lot of what he said, or that sort of illuminated it. Mrs. Betty Riley spoke about how the Housing Authority denied her rental application, even though she knew the apartment she had applied for was vacant. Mrs. Lee Fowler told of how her family was denied housing at both University Homes and St. John's Woods because their family was too large at 11 people. She asked how a family of 11 could live in the tiny trailers with no place for children to be, especially during the rainy season. Others gave similar testimony, talking about how the trailer accommodations were inadequate, to say the least, and that the rent at $36 a month was too much. And I have to say that until looking into this, I didn't realize that they had to pay rent to live in those trailers. After one of the testimonies, the people applauded, and Mayor Riley admonished them, saying, "The surest way that you can have this hearing recessed, and recessed permanently, is to start demonstrations. That will be positive. You start demonstrations and the hearing will be recessed, and there will be no hearing." So unlike the hearing on the 16th, this one did get heated, but I don't think enough to warrant ending it. But anyway, not to get ahead of myself. So Mr. Victor Todd was the closing speaker that day. And I'm going to read to you a little of what he said. Victor Todd was also named in the Red Squad files at the Portland City Archives as being on a FBI communist watch list. So Mr. Victor Todd, in closing, said, "The members of the Housing Authority, who were all men of outstanding intelligence, knew that the Smith Lake dike could not withstand the floodwaters. The only thing they did know was whether this spill would give. The only thing they did not know was whether this spill would give way during the night or daytime. The people became restless days before the disaster. To counteract this restlessness, the Housing Authority of Portland issued a bulletin to all of us, which unfortunately we believed. It told us to take it easy and not to worry. The result was that many of us lost our lives. All of us lost our property, and we faced years of difficulties and problems for ourselves. Now, I say this crime was committed against the people, and the very least we can do, is to have the outright public dismissal of every member of this commission. Therefore, I make that as our demand." So after Mr. Albertson said that, the audience erupted into applause. And that was it for Mayor Riley. He said, "I am sure that I gave the warning about demonstrations, and we are going to recess because of that violation." He then ordered the report to be placed on file. The newspaper articles reported on Mayor Riley adjourning the hearing because the 200 people sitting in the chamber broke into loud applause. As one of the committee members summed up the grievances and demanded the dismissal of the Housing Authority. The mayor also ordered the petition placed on file, as I mentioned. And to be completely honest, I haven't been able to figure out what that really means, beyond that it just is on on record. It's on the file. So I don't know what happened beyond that with the Vanport Tenants League and the Citizen Committee's efforts to get reparations, to get help for Vanport flood victims. As for Mrs. Walker, Mr. Whitney, and Mr. Curry, they went on to live long, full lives. Miss Walker ended up getting hired as the program director at Williams Avenue Center YMCA in July of 1948, so not too much long after that last meeting. And she became the first African American to teach in Portland Public Schools' home economics department, and later became a counselor at Jefferson High School. And I believe there's also a daycare center here in town that is named after her. So Samuel Whitney, he seems to have stayed in Portland, and he worked as an electrician. In 1950, interesting side note I found, in 1950, his wife Louise gave birth to their 8th child, who they named Harry Truman Whitney. A newspaper article quoted Samuel Whitney as saying that they chose the name, quote, because of the president's fight for civil rights, end quote. So then in 1948, Estes Curry ran as a Progressive Party candidate for the state legislature, receiving 18,064 votes and finishing 8th. In 1949, he served as secretary of the Citizens Committee for Civil Rights, which advocated for a city ordinance prohibiting racial discrimination in licensed businesses in Portland. The ordinance didn't pass and was voted against 55 to 45%. And he moved to California in 1956. And that is the end of the presentation on the research. For further research, I can talk about this a little more when Mariah comes on if she wants, but I would put a call out to the Vanport community, the survivors and descendants, to see what they know about any of this. We would love to hear. I think it would be great to look more into the individual stories of the people involved. There was some relief money that came from, I think, Greenville, Mississippi, and there's a whole story there that I just didn't include because it didn't really feel like I had time to do it justice. And then there were more than 700 claims that were filed against the United States under the Federal Tort Claims Act that are related to the flood. And I think that those really bear looking into to see if there's maybe something there, maybe some novel legal theory or something. There's people doing all kinds of work with those. And then whatever happened with the bill they were working on, there was also a bill. So those would all be just some things to look into. And these are just people and places that I want to make sure to thank. First of all, the Vanport Survivor and Descendant Community, the Vanport Mosaic, Laura Loforti, Aisha Khan, Portland City Archives, Scott Daniels at Oregon Historical Society, Professor James Harrison, and Kelly Bosworth. And then, as Mariah mentioned at the beginning, we are in the middle, actually, of our 10th annual Vanport Mosaic Festival. May 16th through June 1st, we do have a few things left happening this week. Thursday and Wednesday and Thursday at Alberta House, and then Saturday and Sunday at Expo Center. So there's a QR code, you can scan it, or there's a link at the bottom. So I hope to see some of you there. And yeah, Mariah, whenever you're ready, I'm ready for you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for sharing that awesome research with us. That was so interesting. I really love that you like went in and highlighted specific people. I think that a lot of times when we're looking at this history, we can kind of get caught up in what happened and forget that there were like actual human beings that lived this history. And so I think it was kind of cool just to learn a little bit more about them in addition to the work that they were doing with this. So anyways, all that to say, thank you so much for sharing this awesome research with us. And I would love to kind of pick your brain a little bit more about it, ask some questions that we got in the chat, and just kind of discuss it a little bit further.
Sure.
So, right off the bat, one of the things that you said at the very end got me intrigued. And I know that there are a lot of questions. It's interesting. You gave us a lot of information, but really it just gave me a lot of different threads that I also want to pull. So, I was curious, could you tell us a little bit more about the bill that they were working on? Like what it was, how much you know about it, even
Yeah.
if we don't know what happened with it?
Yeah, it was just I don't know that much about it. I did
Sure.
start to kind of go into it, and then I was like, "You know what? I'm not gonna do that right now. I'm going to put that on into the bucket of things to look into later."
Mm,
But it was a bill that people were working on putting together, after the flood, and there was something about federal money,
mm.
but I shouldn't really speak too much more about it because I don't have the specifics.
No
But I
worries, that's
do have
okay.
sources that I'm happy to share,
Yeah.
organizing my handy little spreadsheet thing.
Perfect. Okay, cool. So if anybody does want to, look into that thread and pull that one, Greta is willing to share some of those sources, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
For those of you watching that are intrigued with the story. I was also curious because you went into detail on those three individuals, which was really cool to see. But I was curious how many people you saw involved in it more generally. Was it like an evolving cast of characters with 30 plus, or was it like a core group of 10? Is there a reason that you picked these specific
Mm.
people? Were they like the only Black participants, or were there other Black folks that you had noticed being a part of it? I'm curious a little bit about the makeup of that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Well, first of all, I focused on these three folks because, well, one, there were pictures uh,
Mm, so
with
fair.
gold, right? And
Yes.
then two, they did appear a lot and at different
Mm,
points in time. And I didn't get to get into it too as much as I wanted to, but like Estes Curry, he really had like quite a legacy, in Portland um, after his work with the Tenants League and the Flood
right.
Committee, which I'd never heard of him before. I don't know if anyone has really heard. I think maybe Miss Carmen Walker people, because it
Mm,
seems like she had also quite a legacy, specifically working with in education and stuff
yeah.
like that. So
That's so cool. You mentioned there might be a center in Portland named after her.
yeah, I'm pretty
Oh,
sure there is actually. I just can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, and I didn't have it in my notes. But I
sure.
did see, I think, a 2024 article about this childcare center being named for her. So,
I love
yeah,
that so much. So now anybody who happens to see that childcare center can actually connect it to
yeah,
this beautiful legacy that she has.
yeah, absolutely. And then in terms of the other people, it really, I kept seeing I think maybe there were like 10 people who I saw pretty
Mm,
consistently, and they all had such fascinating stories. But I really had to whittle it down because
sure.
I wanted to because of my darn two-part question. But yeah, it was really an interracial coalition, but it was
Yeah.
largely Black led from what I can tell, especially in the later years. It seems in the beginning there was a strong contingent of like labor organizers um, and people who were uh, communists, like part of
Mm,
the Communist Party, uh,
right.
were doing this. And then there was
Yeah.
sort of a convergence, really, with that Vanport Interracial Council that I talked about in the beginning. That's sort of where I saw people coming together because I would
Mm,
see names of people like there's a person named Sam Markson who's just so interesting,
mm.
um, but I couldn't include him, and he's a white man
Sure.
as
That makes
well.
sense because, yeah, Vanport was, as you mentioned, a very diverse area. So this story touches more than just Black history, of course, but
Definitely.
really it touches Oregon history and important history to talk about. And you actually brought up a question that we have in the chat, which is, were you able to find out what the goals of the Vanport Interracial League were? Because I think a lot of folks probably heard that, like, oh, Vanport Interracial League, what could that be? What were they, it's interesting. What were they working on? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, they were, I think because there were so many people from different backgrounds and different races in Vanport, some of them came from places where, like, you weren't together,
Mm,
it was segregated, the
absolutely.
South, Jim Crow South. And so the Vanport Interracial Council was really trying to educate, especially the youth.
Mm.
They were showing movies. They were having speakers. They showed a movie. I found an article that talked about them showing a movie, this film called Passes and Barriers, that was about Japanese incarceration during World War II.
What?
Yeah,
They were showing that in
they
Vanport.
were showing that in
That's
Van.
wow.
So they were.
That is intense.
I really think that so that's another thing. I want to look more into them as well.
Mm,
I mean,
yeah.
there's so much rich history and stories here. So,
Yeah, absolutely. I love to hear that they were, bringing in film and kind of engaging people in different ways
mhm.
to spread, I assume, interracial goodwill at that point in time. That sounds like the perfect, perfect fodder for another episode of Black History Quest down the road to learn more about their efforts. We've also got another question from the chat. We were curious, what else can you tell us about the temporary residences of the Vanport refugees? Like, do you know where the trailers were parked?
Mhm.
You kind of briefly alluded to the fact that they may have been paying rent for the trailers during this, in what I assume was like a relocation. I assumed that you didn't have to pay, like you kind of
Right.
mentioned. So, and might not have all the answers, but whatever you can share, I'm sure folks
Sure.
would be interested
Yeah.
to hear.
Well, I know that there's actually a really interesting article. As I'm talking to you, I'm just remembering all of these things that I wanted
Sure.
to include, but just had to.
Well, you can tell us now.
Okay, but,
Yeah.
there's a really interesting article in the Northwest Examiner, which,
Mm,
is a historically Black newspaper operating out of Seattle, and they had a Portland
yeah.
section. And so there's a great article in there about people, having a hard time finding housing after
Mm,
the flood, and they talk about, um, all it's just such an interesting article. But anyway, they talk about people living in private homes. So, and they talked specifically about how some Black families and some interracial families, because there were interracial families in Vanport, um, going and staying with white families in Portland. So
interesting.
that was one thing that they did. Like, I talked about the woman with the family of 11.
Hmm.
I think that they were staying in a private home, which,
Mm,
that's really nice and all, but, like, I imagine it would get strained and be uncomfortable. And, but I've heard of that happening with multiple families. And then also
mm,
the trailers at Guilds Lake, and, those were just they called them kennels on wheels. They were really
oh,
small. There was barely room to even stretch out or, like, sit. And so there were families living in these. And people talked about how there's just nowhere for the kids to be. Families had to sometimes get multiple trailers to house everyone. And then apparently it was an extra $10 per unit for your family if you had a family that. So I was shocked that they had to pay for these trailers. And
yeah.
also, I do feel like some of the resolutions that they presented did get addressed, but I just haven't figured out exactly how yet. And I think
Sure.
that might have been one that did get addressed eventually, but I don't know.
Yeah. That that's so fair. So that actually kind of leads into another question that I always like to ask, which is like, in what ways did your findings meet your expectations, or how were they different? What were you, hoping you might be able to uncover that you didn't, or vice versa? What kind of surprised you?
Gosh. I mean, it all surprised me.
Sure.
It was so exciting, and it was so cool to see this story. I feel like I don't often get to look at histories, uncover stories that are like kind of joyful in a
Yeah,
sense.
a
And
little
I
bit
really,
brighter.
it's so
Yeah.
cool to see like them during that period that's before the flood doing all that work and getting some wins. And they had a Mother's Day celebration and just learning about sort of what their lives were like. You know, during all of this, they were working, they were having children, things were
Mm.
happening. It was life. Like they had full time jobs aside from this,
Yeah.
and it was a lot. They were meeting, especially after the flood. They met all the time. I mean,
Oh,
public meetings were weekly, and I imagine that they had a lot of like smaller sort of meetings with just the main folks. But yeah, I feel like I got a little sidetracked there, but I just really
so
didn't
fair.
know what I was gonna find
Yeah.
or anything, and, so I was really delighted and surprised by all of it, and I just wanna keep digging into it, but speaking of full-time jobs, I got my own job to do.
Yeah, right. Exactly. You have your own job and you're very busy this week with all of the incredible things that Vanport Mosaic is putting together to help tell and uplift these stories. And while we're talking about this, I feel like it is a good opportunity just to plug your organization, Vanport Mosaic, as a partner with Oregon Black Pioneers, and really as an incredible resource for folks who want to, help uplift these stories and really want to engage with the people that lived it like themselves. So people, Vanport Mosaic has a wealth of information on their website, including like oral histories and things like that, to give people a little bit of perspective into this, this incredible community and then this incredible loss as a result of the flood. So just an opportunity to plug that organization,
Yeah,
and
thanks,
then
Mara.
yeah, because
Appreciate that.
there's really cool events happening throughout Portland for the rest of the week. And even one of the researchers that you listed as a thank you, I
Yes!
think, is doing
Kelly
an event
Ellsworth,
tomorrow.
yeah,
Yeah.
tomorrow at Alberta House.
Yeah.
I think it's from 6 to 8, and she's gonna give a presentation on teachers in Vanport. I think
Oh,
specifically focusing on a music teacher, but then also talking about some other teachers as well. I'm
oh,
personally super excited to see this presentation. Uh,
yeah.
so yeah, everyone should come. It's gonna be great.
Cool. Well, then if you happen to join tomorrow, you'll hopefully see Greta in person at this event from the sounds of it. So you kind of touched on in both your presentation and in our conversation, like where you would go in your, next research directions. There's ample things to kind of look into, like that interracial league and just kind of what they did with the bill, for example. But is there anything else that you really want to bite into at some point related to this work that you've been doing?
Well, speaking of reparations, I just can't help but think, I mean, those torts that I mentioned, those 700 tort cases that I mentioned, looking into those to see kind of what the deal was there and what happened with those. Because I don't know, I just still, I think like so many people feel that there are remunerations due here.
Mm,
And
yeah,
so I like to think that some of this that we're getting can kind of speak to that and help make a case for that.
absolutely. Now, since we're talking about it, I'm thinking about all the different like pillars that they were requesting, and really thinking about how like thoughtful and provoking. I think was it Irvin?
Irvin
Was it Irvin?
Goodman,
Yeah, yeah. Talking at that last meeting, is if I'm remembering correctly,
Von
is
Albert.
that? Oh, okay, okay. Well, just talking like the outrage about how the people in charge let this happen. Did you see anything about anybody, coming to terms with that? Like, did anybody get fired? Was there any sort of, reaction for those folks that you had seen? Because that part of your
So
presentation made me think of it.
yeah, no, that's I'm glad that you brought that up. First of all, I have to correct myself. It was Mr. Victor Todd who gave that last closing remark at that last meeting. But to answer that question, so this is another thing that I want to look into more, and kind of something I alluded to earlier, is that I did see in some later newspaper articles that I pulled, there was, it looked like talks about discussions around reformating the council, the housing authority, and having
Oh.
sort of a conglomeration of people from different organizations
Hmm.
to form a new one, or at least an advisory group to the Housing Authority of Portland. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's I feel like I have a lot of other questions, but we're just gonna have to keep keep connecting, and hopefully we'll see each other at one of these Vanport Mosaic events that's coming up this week. But before I let you go, I want to make sure to take a second and, well, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about or share with us in the last few minutes
I don't think so.
before I
I just
ask the last
want to
question? Okay.
thank you for this opportunity. It was really great to get to, you know, shed some light on this story, on these people, and I'm I'm so happy to have gotten to tell people about them.
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad that, yeah, that you were able to dive in and surface with some interesting stuff. We really appreciate it. But just to kind of like wrap it all up, I gotta ask, how has what you uncovered changed our understanding of history here in
Mm,
Oregon?
That is such a big question. I I don't know that I could speak for everyone, but for me,
Mm.
I didn't I don't think that I understood the level of care
Mm.
and activism that was going on in Vanport
Yeah.
during, both before and during and after, well, during the flood. I mean, during the flood was, but before and after the flood. And I, one of the things that it kind of struck for me was that I think that some of that spirit in some ways is really still here. Um,
Mm.
we have an annual gathering of Vanport survivors and descendants. And I mean, that's just it's the best. It's part of the festival. It's a private event. It's my favorite. I'm so glad
I
that,
bet.
honored that I get to be there. But but I see that spirit
Mm.
in the survivors and their descendants. It's a community of care.
Oh, wow, that was beautiful and so aptly put. And like I said, that's why I recommend checking out Vanport Mosaic, because they work so often with these folks. So it's really cool to get to uplift them. And I feel like what I'm taking away from it is this incredible thread of the justice and people fighting for it both before and after. But for me, it's kind of like these people had one of the most horrific things you can imagine happen to you, and still they fought back. And that is just like seeing this play out, even if it didn't necessarily result in what you're hoping for. That like fighting spirit is just really something that I think we could all use a little reminder and hope of. So yeah, thank
Definitely.
you so much for sharing.
They were doing it like days after, they had
Yeah.
their first mass meeting. 1,000 people were there. It's incredible.
That's what I'm saying. It's like, wow,
Yeah.
literally in the aftermath, and they were immediately organizing. Like, that's such a cool story to tell, and gives a lot more, instead of this as just something that happened to them, like this is something that did they reacted to as well, and to the best of their ability, and it's very cool to see. So yeah. It has just been absolutely wonderful getting to learn from you and hear a little bit more about this and what your organization's doing. So, thank you so much for being our history investigator this time and sharing your research with us.
Thanks for having me.
Heck yeah. All right. Well, that'll do it for this episode of Black History Quest. As always, we want to thank the Collins Foundation for sponsoring this show. You can learn more about them and the projects that they support. And don't forget to check us out at OregonBlackPioneers.org. If you like the show and want to help support others like it, consider a donation at our website, OregonBlackPioneers.org. And finally, if you have any questions about this episode or would like to become a history investigator yourself, please send an email to hello@OregonBlackPioneers.org. Stay tuned for the next episode of Black History Quest in July, where, as always, we'll try to answer the question, how can one source change history? Thank you so much for joining us, and good night.